In naval history, few topics are quite as interesting as Japanese cruiser design. In these, as in many things, the Japanese went their own way. For example, in their very heavy focus on torpedoes. Few other nations put quite so much emphasis on this for cruisers, and none were as dedicated to the idea as the Japanese. There were also the various attempts at slipping under naval treaties, best exemplified by the Mogami-class cruiser, and their switch from light cruiser to heavy cruiser the moment the Japanese gave up paying lip service to the naval treaties. And then you have the various specialized ships, the Tones being the best known alongside the command ship Oyota. Today's video, however, will be looking at a different specialized design, that being Katori, a ship intended for training. Slow, lightly armed and armored, and not at all intended for direct combat action. However, as was often the case, plans would change. And while the Japanese didn't send the ships into heavy combat, well, they were used for things other than training. For example, flagship duty or commanding escort squadrons. Ultimately, 2 of the class would be sunk, Kashi by air attack, and today's topic, Katori, by gunfire from USS Iowa. This marks the one and only time a Japanese cruiser, even a training ship, was sunk by an Iowa-class battleship, an interesting distinction to say the least, as well as an unfortunate one for the ship and her crew. However, this will come later. As Katori was the nameship of her class, we need to begin with the background and the design, before looking to her admittedly short service history. This is a story that began in the early 1930s. Up to this point, the Japanese Navy had been using old cruisers for training their new crews. In each era of the fleet, this saw different ships pressed into this role. Generally, as ships became too obsolete, they would be replaced by more modern, but still second-line warships. By the 1930s, this was 3 armored cruisers, Asama, Iwate, and Yakumo. They had been operating in this role since before the Great War, and by the 1930s were definitely wearing out. The ships were over 30 years old by that point. Well aware of this fact, the Japanese were planning on continuing their traditional pattern. To replace the 3 armored cruisers, they would take 3 of the newer Kuma class and put them in the training role. Those ships were newer, but at the same time, increasingly outdated in the face of naval development. They would have to be decommissioned anyway to hold to the London Naval Treaty once the new Kumano and Suzuya were commissioned. This was the plan as of 1933. However, budget restraints saw the conversion pushed back, and eventually canceled altogether when the Japanese stopped holding to the naval treaties. The Kumas would instead be turned into floating torpedo batteries. Kitakami is the best known in this regard, thanks to World of Warships. So, a new plan was required. This was made even more apparent when Asama was badly damaged in October 1935. The cruiser ran aground and wasn't viewed worth repairing. That left just Iwate and Yakumo to train an expanding set of new crews to match the growing Navy. As such, in 1937, the Japanese set about building 3 dedicated training cruisers. These would become the Katori class, which is a good point to shift to the design, because these ships were completely unlike any other Japanese cruiser. Normally, I'd start with the displacement. However, before then, it's important to note that difference in design. First and foremost, the Katoris were not built as fighting ships. This is reflected in three major aspects. First, priority in the design was given over to accommodation. The ships were relatively roomy on the inside, especially by Japanese standards, both to make them more comfortable, but also to stand up when sent on foreign visits. Something the ships would never actually do, but that's for later. The second note came in the weaponry. This wasn't designed for combat, but for training. That meant a fairly light loadout, and one laid out better for training cadets than actual combat. And the third note was in overall hull form. These were short and squat ships. They were, again, designed for comfort and ease of training, unlike traditional Japanese cruisers, which were long and lean, meant for high-speed attacks, not for comfort. Specifically, Katori was 129.7 meters, 425 feet 9 inches long, with a beam of 15.9 meters, 52 feet and 4 inches. For comparison, the contemporary Mogami was 201 meters, 661 feet long, with a beam of 20 meters or 67 feet. Mogami has a wider beam to be sure, but she's also some 70 meters longer, a much leaner overall length-to-beam ratio, thus a faster ship, with Mogami capable of 37 knots, though this was somewhat reduced after her refit. As for Katori, well, she could make 18 knots on a good day, on only 8,000 shaft horsepower with a mixed turbine and diesel propulsion system. In any event, we've gone a bit out of order today. Let's move back to displacement and go from there. Katori displaced 5,890 tons at her normal loading. This went up to 6,180 when fully loaded, which is still pretty light by contemporary standards, with this small size definitely reflected in the weaponry. The ships carried only 4 140mm 5.5-inch guns in 2 twin mounts, one on the bow and one on the stern, with the secondary battery, such as it was, consisting of 2 127mm 5-inch guns in a single twin mount, with the weaponry rounded off by 4 25mm guns in 2 twin mounts. And because this is still a Japanese ship at the end of the day, 2 twin torpedo tubes for a total of 4 torpedoes. This weaponry was, as you can see, really quite light, but it was a good spread of Japanese weapons at the time, which was perfect for training sailors destined for proper warships. As for the armor, well, there was none. As training ships, the Japanese didn't bother spending tonnage on armor protection. An understandable decision, really. And a decision that brings us to the end of the background and design. Now let's turn to Katori's service, such as it was. This story began on August 24th, 1938, at the Mitsubishi shipyard in Yokohama. On that day, Katori was laid down, with a relatively fast construction following. This saw the ship launched on June 17th, 1939, while she was commissioned on April 20th, 1940. You can see why I said she never went on foreign visits. The Second World War was underway at this point, and Japan was only a year and a half away from joining in. As for Katori, her first proper voyage came in August 1940, when she joined her sister ship Kashima on a long-term training voyage. the final midshipman training cruise prior to Pearl Harbor, because in November 1940, the ship was reassigned as flagship of the Sixth Fleet submarines. Remember earlier, as I said, the Katoris could and would be used as flagships. This is one such example. She would remain in this role through to the end of 1941, something that saw a meeting aboard the cruiser on November 11th, 1941. A briefing of submarine commanders on the upcoming Pearl Harbor attack. After this, Katori set sail on November 24th. She would first sail around Saipan, spotting an American convoy on November 28th. After this, she turned for Truk, arriving there on December 1st, though she would actually leave the very next day, December 2nd. Katori would arrive at Kwajalein on December 5th, where she remained through the attack on Pearl Harbor. Unsurprisingly, she didn't sail with the fleet involved in that attack. In fact, Katori would be back at Truk by the end of December. She would remain there through late January 1942, during which the cruiser was used for more meetings. Among other things, the planning for the invasion of the Solomons. Again, that administrative flagship thing coming into play. Katori's relatively roomy accommodations were quite useful for meetings of this nature. Certainly more comfortable than any traditional cruiser. That said, the ship would have been better off if late January had extended just a little bit longer. As it would turn out, she left Truk by the end of the month to return to Kwajalein, which proved to be unfortunate, because on February 1st, 1942, Admiral Halsey stopped by. Aircraft from Enterprise raided Kwajalein on one of the pinprick raids that defined early 1942. In this case, Dauntlesses and Devastators sank a transport and damaged several warships, among them Katori. Her damage wasn't terrible, but it was sufficient to send her back to Japan for proper repair work. She would arrive back home on February 16th, 1942, and remain in dry dock until March 5th, though she remained near Japan at this point. It was only in late April that she returned to Truk, arriving there on April 20th, at which point, Katori did a pretty typical rotation for second-line Japanese warships. She would bounce between various island bastions. In her case, though, it was as part of her flagship duty. Be it Truk or Kwajalein, she was commanding the submarines. For example, in April 1942, she helped direct the submarines for the Battle of Midway. However, by August of the same year, the ship needed a refit, so she sailed back to Japan, arriving on August 8th, where, among other things, the ship picked up 4 more 25mm guns. After this, it was back to Truk, where she arrived on August 24th, 1942, and would remain for the next 7 months. Katori remained docked in harbor, performing her flagship role from relative safety, with the ship only returning to Japan for another refit on March 26, 1943. By May 11th, she was back at Truk, where Katori would remain for the rest of her service history, as it would turn out. She never left harbor for the rest of 1943 and into early 1944. It was only on February 15th that she was finally reassigned to the General Escort Command. This would likely have seen her refit with depth charges and improved anti-aircraft guns like her sisters. Unfortunately, Katori never got the chance. Operation Hailstone, the major attack on Truk, came on February 17th and 18th of 1944. Katori had actually left before this, escorting an armed merchant cruiser. This wouldn't save her. The ship was hit by a torpedo around 5 a.m. on February 18th. This did relatively minor damage, but the ship would soon have larger issues. Katori was attacked by American surface forces. New Jersey, Iowa, Minneapolis, and New Orleans, along with the destroyers Bradford and Burns. One of her escorts, Maikaze, was sunk by cruiser gunfire. Katori herself was fired on by Iowa. 46 16-inch shells plus 124 5-inch shells. All 8 salvos straddled the cruiser, with Katori listing to port by the 4th. After 11 minutes of shell fire, the cruiser sank. While survivors were in the water, none were picked up, leaving Katori to go down with all hands. Her remaining escort, Milwaukee, escaped despite being chased by both Iowa and New Jersey, including shells fired at 22 miles, the longest range shots from any American battleship. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.